Manipal University, Jaipur, feel honored and privileged to welcome our guests and distinguished speakers, Mr. Arun Kumar Singh, Mr. Shankar Aiyar, and Dr. Aparna Pande ma'am, and all the participants for today's webinar on the topic Future of India US Relations. I take this opportunity to extend my heartiest gratitude to each and everyone present with us today. Before we start with today's panel discussion, I would like you all to follow certain instructions during today's webinar. All the participants are requested to keep their microphones on mute during the webinar. All the questions and queries should not be posted on the chat group and should be personally sent to Himangini on Zoom chat itself. Thank you. And now I would invite Dr. Arpana ma'am to proceed with the panel discussion.
Thank you. Good evening, and I would like to start by thanking the law school at Manipal University, Jaipur, for inviting me to speak here today. A special thanks to Puran, Raj Purohit, Tanya Prasad, Bhavya, and Himangini for all the arrangements. It is an honor to be on the same panel as two people I respect, former minister, author, and diplomat, Mr. Shankar Aiyar, and former diplomat and ambassador to the United States, Arun Kumar Singh. Relations between the oldest and the largest democracies in the world, the United States and India, date back centuries, even before 1947. In March 2000, President Bill Clinton and then Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee had referred to each other's countries as natural allies. In recent years, the relationship has been referred to as the defining partnership of the 21st century. We are lucky to have with us today two practitioners of diplomatic statecraft who can help us better understand the relationship and where they see it going in the coming days, months, and years. I will now call on Ambassador Singh to deliver his opening remarks, followed by Mr. Aiyar. Ambassador Singh?
Thank you, Aparna. So in my initial comments for about 5 minutes or so, I wanted to focus on what are the factors that have impacted on India-US relations historically. And that will explain what we should look at when we are analyzing the future. I'll also briefly touch upon the trend that we are seeing in the last 2 decades, and then analyze the situation today, and therefore see what does the future hold for us. Now, looking at India-US relations historically, I have found through my experience and study that 4 factors have influenced this relationship over time. And if you look at the relationship in the dimension of these 4 factors, you can explain away decisions, challenges, opportunities at any point of time. And these 4 factors are: 1, what is the global priority that the US has set for itself at any precise time? 2nd, based on that global priority, what is the role that it has assigned to Pakistan? Therefore, what is the nature of the US-Pakistan relationship, and then how does it impact on India? 3rd, again in the framework of the global priorities, what is the nature of its relationship with China? Because then that also impacts on India. And finally, what is the strength in the bilateral relationship? So for example, you would see that in 1962, when we had the conflict with China, the US was the one country in the world that was most supportive of India because it had a certain approach to communist China. Even the Soviet Union, with which we had a very good relationship by then, was not as supportive because it had the communist linkage with China. But then if you look at 1971, it was the United States that took a firm position against India and sent the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal for what was seen as a coercive action against India, because it wanted to act as a protector for Pakistan and also as a signal to China, with which it was trying to start a new relationship, that the United States stood by its friends and allies because it wanted to wean China away from the Soviet Union to sharpen the Sino-Soviet split. So these are the factors that affect the dimensions of the relationship. Now, if we look at the relationship since 2000, and you briefly referred to the Clinton-Vajpayee effort, there has been a broad bipartisan support for the relationship. Since 2000, we've had Democratic and Republican presidents in the US. It was a Democrat, Clinton, who came to India in 2000 to start the new phase in the relationship. It was a Republican, George Bush, who did the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with India, which enabled India then to also do civil nuclear commerce with other countries in the world. With Russia, get more nuclear power plants. From several other countries, start being able to import uranium, something that it was not able to do because of the restrictions that had been brought to the nuclear suppliers group. It was then a Democrat, Barack Obama, who visited India twice, and the first US president to have visited India twice in his tenure. He visited India on our Republic Day in 2015. And although, as you mentioned, US is the world's oldest democracy, India is the largest democracy, no US president had visited India on our Republic Day, the day on which we gave to ourselves our constitution and firmly establishing India as a democratic republic. And so this was the first time, and it was reflecting the change in the nature of the relationship. President Obama articulated support for India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council. He also declared India a major defense partner. Following the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, higher level technology releases have been done from India, and there is very little technology denial that now happens in practice. And then after President Obama, really a maverick Republican President Trump came to office, and there was a lot of uncertainty how the relationship with would evolve under him. But despite all his various other sort of what many would describe as idiosyncrasies, unpredictable policies, the relationship with India has moved in a positive trajectory. He visited India at the end of February. His administration has put India in what is called STA1, Strategic Trade Authorization Level 1, for highest level technology releases similar to what is done with friends and partners. He has authorized sales of defense equipment at higher technology levels that were done even during the Obama administration. So we can see that since 2000, with changes in government in the US, and be it a Republican or a Democrat, there is a bipartisan support, and that is what we see also reflected in the US Congress. Now, there are dimensions in the bilateral relationship which reflect the sources of strength for the relationship. US is India's largest trading partner when we look at trade in goods and services. And the trade is in India's favor. India has a surplus with the United States, even though it is an overall trade deficit country. There is significant US investment in India, amounting to almost about $30 billion. But what is interesting is that the Indian companies have also invested in the US and amounting to almost $20 billion in IT, in pharmaceuticals, and other sectors, reflecting the opportunity they find in the US and the technology partnerships that they are looking for in the United States. There are 4 million Indian Americans in the United States. It's the largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. 1 out of 7 patients in the US is seen by an Indian origin doctor. It is said that almost 40% of hotel rooms in the United States are owned and managed by Indian Americans, and generating $13 billion of revenue and paying taxes, social security contributions. Till about 2016, historically, only 3 Indian Americans were ever present in US Congress. Since then, at any point of time, there are 5 Indian Americans present in the US Congress, both in the House of Representatives and Senate. This again is reflecting the growing presence and influence of the Indian origin community in the United States, which is now the highest median income ethnic group in that country, and also the highest in terms of the level of education. There are almost 200,000 Indian students in US universities, and we are contributing almost $6 billion just as tuition fees to US universities. And of course, at one level, it's a dream. We would rather that Indian universities were able to provide that education. But despite this, through that linkage, they are then able to build economic and business relationships between India and the US. So the people-to-people dimension of the relationship is extremely strong, among the strongest in the world. So given this overall dimension, how do we see the relationship in the coming period with all the challenges that COVID has brought about, the tremendous economic disruption across the world, travel disruptions, various restrictions that have come into play? So I would say, one, that the Pakistan dimension of the relationship and its impact will fade a little in the coming period. In the last 20 years, US has attached relationship to Pakistan because of its effort in Afghanistan. Its presence in Afghanistan has required the US to send all its supplies through Pakistan, and therefore US has needed Pakistan in a certain way. As the US is now trying to leave Afghanistan, and if it is able to successfully leave Afghanistan, and it may have some negative consequences for India. They're leaving Afghanistan because if there's instability, if terrorist groups again start operating, there will be negative consequences for India. But at the same time, once they leave Afghanistan, their dependence on Pakistan will come down. So that would be one positive dimension. The negative dimension in that would be that US has of late been generating pressure on Pakistan to take action against terrorism. And it has been doing that because terrorist groups based in Pakistan and in Afghanistan have been attacking the US. And the US has also been attacking US troops in Afghanistan. So US has seen a threat to its own interests from terrorist groups based in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, if that threat gets removed, then US would be less focused on that. And therefore, the pressure that comes from them on Pakistan on account of terrorism may come down. So that would be a negative aspect, but their dependence on Pakistan and they're trying to give various forms of assistance and other things to Pakistan would also come down. So that would be one dimension. Although US would certainly want to remain engaged with Pakistan, partly on account of the terrorism factor, but also because the US sees that Pakistan is a nuclear weapons capable country and it's important to have some form of relationship. I think the real sort of defining factor would be the US-China relationship. If you see the various statements coming out from the United States now, it is clear that they see China as a major technological competitor. And the manner in which China has handled the initial phase of COVID, there is a certain amount of anti-China sentiment in the United States because of the way the virus spread. So in the period ahead, US will be focusing a lot on the military, technological, economic challenge from China. And therefore, in that framework, there will be opportunities for expanding further the India-US relationship. And I'm not saying that India should take on an anti-China position. I think India has to look at issues from the perspective of its own interest, because every country in its foreign policy looks at issues from the perspective of its own interest. But the way the US would approach China would provide space for India to work more with the US in the economic domain, in the technology domain, and work for strengthening itself, because the US leaders have articulated now that they see the rise of India to be in US interest, or that they see India as a net technology provider in this region. So given that, they would be more positively oriented towards deepening the relationship with India. So in the post-COVID phase, there is going to be a disruption of supply chains. There will be a rebalancing of supply chains, and the focus that has been on China for supplies is going to be removed a little bit, because there has been a sense that the security of US and Europe has been impacted by the dependence on China. So when this rebalancing of supply chains happens, there will be opportunity for Indian companies, for manufacturing in India to become more a part of the global supply chain, which can have a positive effect on the Indian economy and industry. So let me stop here for now. And of course, I'd be happy to elaborate further in the subsequent discussions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Aiyar, your remarks, please.
Well, I largely agree with the background that has been painted by Mr. Arun Singh. But except at the end, when he brought in Indian interests, the rest of it seemed to be an exposition of the US view of the world, US interests, and how we could take advantage of those US interests by not stepping on their corns, as we used to do, and trying to be as materialistic as possible in creating a relationship with. I would like to look upon this from an Indian perspective. I think in 1947, we were quite clear that India's most important interest was to be sovereign in our external affairs in order to extend our internal sovereignty, which we had secured from British rule, onto the world stage. And in consequence, during the heyday of non-alignment and peaceful coexistence, we seemed to be able to have a good relationship with everybody. And because we had a good relationship with everybody, we really mattered as an individual voice in world affairs. And I still think that that is where the basic Indian interest lies, not in just adapting ourselves to how the world changes, but in ensuring that as the world changes, we adapt ourselves without losing our fundamental desire to be a free and independent country. Now, in this light, I think we faced a major change in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And therefore, we were in an unaligned world. So how do you promote non-alignment in an unaligned world? And we were able, because the Americans themselves were faced with being a hegemonic power. There was little challenge to them in the early 30s, 90s. They seem to have come to the conclusion that they want to be hegemonic, but they will be a benevolent, they will run a benevolent where they will not put American interests exclusively at the top, but be general in their relationship with the rest of the world. But in the immediate past, I refer to the last 4 years of Mr. Trump, there has been a doctrine of America first, which has resulted in a huge disruption of America's ties with its traditional allies and also with the rest of the world. One example, Mr. Trump had just returned to the White House from a triumphant reception in Ahmedabad, and he then had no inhibition about threatening India with any export control on hydroxychloroquine. I think that's what it's called. Now should warn us to see that the more self-sufficient we are in promoting our own interests, the more likely it is that we will be able to confront this world, which is changing because of a change in America's overall global view. Now, if we are all very lucky, then in November this year, this disruptive period of the last 4 years in American foreign policy will come to an end and we can go back to a period of greater normalcy. But even if we do, I think we ought to realize that the more we are able to articulate our position in our own ways, the greater is the strength of India. And that we don't have to be looking to see whether America will support us when it comes to our relationship with Pakistan, or will America support us when it comes to our relationship with China. But at this commencement of the second Cold War, which is coming upon us, we are now in the year 1946, as far as US-China relations are concerned, because it was in 1946 that US-USSR relations took a dramatic change for the worse and then defined the world between 1946 and 1991. Over the last 30 years, while links with China have been built up enormously by the United States, they're now getting the blowback of China having succeeded. So where do we stand in the second Cold War? Are we going to resume a non-aligned position instead of a neutral position? Or are we going to start leaning in one direction so that we become the Pakistan of the second world, of the second Cold War? I think that is our fundamental existential problem in foreign relations. And I very much believe that if only we would take the initiative and persist the initiative, it is possible for us to isolate our bilateral relationship with Pakistan from the gusts of the Second World Cold War, as also to continue persistently and with faith in ourselves the process that began when Rajiv Gandhi, after a gap of 26 years in India-China relations, visited Beijing and started a process which has brought us as far as it has. And so I hope we will be self-sufficient and self-confident in the conduct of our foreign relations and not make it dependent on our relationship with a power, however much of a superpower it may be. And at the same time, I hope that after November 2020, we can go back to a benevolent hegemony of the United States instead of the current disruptive hegemony. That would be the basis on which we could have a more permanent relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aiyar. I'd now like to pick up on some things that both of you mentioned, and I'll actually start with continuance of the China factor. But here, what I would like to ask both of you is, in the last 10 years or maybe 15 years, it's not just a change in the India-US relationship and how US views Pakistan and South Asia, but also a change in how China has viewed South Asia. In the last 2 decades, there has been a closer relationship between China and all of India's neighbors. China has a very close relationship with Pakistan through CPEC. China is in Nepal. China is in Bangladesh. China is in Sri Lanka. China is in Maldives. China would love to be in Bhutan as well. And right now, as we know, there have been clashes between both the countries. So my question is, China is one of our top trading partners. Relations have continued despite the conflict. Yet, from my point of view, China has shown a reluctance to actually improve relations with India. Despite the summit meetings, the border clashes continue. China's support of Pakistan continues. So in this context, doesn't it make sense to have a closer relationship with the United States and with US allies like Japan and South Korea, so that India can protect its own interests and ensure that its neighborhood remains as free of Chinese control as possible? Throwing the question back at both of you. Ambassador Singh?
All right. So Aparna, so I would agree with what Mr. Aiyar said, is that we have to look at issues from the perspective of India's interest. And each country does that. So when the US, for example, takes certain foreign policy decisions that impact on India, it is not seeing whether India would benefit for it. It is seeing what is in US interest. And the Indian leaders have repeatedly and consistently articulated earlier a policy of non-alignment and later the policy of strategic autonomy, the strategic autonomy of decision-making for India, so that India builds its relationship in the framework of ideally what it would like to see a multipolar world, so that it has the space to be able to take decisions in its own interest and protect its interests. Now, here in the China dimension, as you mentioned, things have changed dramatically. China, over the last 20 years, and especially last 10 years or so, its relative weight in the international system has risen substantially. Its GDP today is 5 times India's GDP. Its military expenditure is 4 times India's military expenditure. It has leased a port, Hambantota in Sri Lanka. It has a military base in Djibouti. It is building a military base in Gwadar in Pakistan. It is building the China-Pakistan, so-called China-Pakistan economic corridor through sovereign Indian territory in Jammu and Kashmir. So, and in also the presence in India's South Asian neighborhood. In other areas that are of interest to India, China has consistently blocked India's interest. It has blocked India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. It has, for a long time, worked at the UN to prevent the listing of Masood Azhar as a global terrorist. Those who watch China closely have suggested that China does not see India as being at its own level. It sees itself as being in the level of the US, sees low, and wants to keep India at that level in the international system, and keeps India challenged through Pakistan, to whom it has provided economic support, military support, and also support for Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. So we have to understand that that is a certain kind of challenge that we are facing from China. So again, while maintaining the autonomy of our decision making, what we need to do is not get involved in anybody else's game, but see how we build our other relationships so that India's capacity to defend its own interests is enhanced. Now, the US today has a challenge in its relationship with China, but it was the US which contributed to the rise of China also since 1970. In 1979, the US Vice President Mondale, visiting China, said that the US sees the rise of China to be in US interest. And even today, there are voices in the US calling for a cooperative relationship with China. Similarly, in Japan, there are those who are concerned at the challenge that China poses to Japan in East China Sea. But there are others that want to build a more cooperative relationship with China. So we have to watch carefully how each country is hedging its interests vis-a-vis China. Europe is doing the same thing. Today, there's growing concern in Europe at Chinese ham-handed tactics to try and prevent the consolidation of the European Union. Because there's a huge information campaign by China in Europe that the European Union failed in the context of COVID, and it is China that is now stepping forward. Countries should become more nationalist. And the Chinese ambassadors in these countries have been putting pressures on governments, on companies to come out with pro-China statements. And that has generated a negative reaction. So again, Europe will be hedging. So I think India has to have a similar approach. It has to have elements of cooperation in its relationship with China, trade, economic, investment, and other, but also build its other relationships so that the space for its choices increase and it can protect its interests. So I think it is in that framework that India will find increasing space in the coming period to consolidate further the relationship with US, with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, and countries in ASEAN like Vietnam and Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Aiyar?
I'm afraid we are our own worst enemy. We just will not enter into an uninterrupted and uninterruptible dialogue with Pakistan to try and resolve our differences bilaterally, although that was the major achievement of the Shimla Agreement in 1972, which is now 38 years old. I don't know why we can't do this. I don't know why we are doing all we can to ruin our relationship with Nepal, starting with our foreign secretary, our foreign minister, who was then foreign secretary, turning up in Nepal 2 days before they proclaimed their constitution and telling them, as one Nepali newspaper said at the time, as if he were Lord Curzon, that they should not proclaim their constitution until we had given our approval to such changes as we desired should be made with them. This is not the way in which we should be treating our neighbors. And if we do, then of course, inevitably, they will look for other friends. And why should Pakistan or Nepal not look to China when they're finding that India is not being friendly? Friendship, like enmity, is a two-way road. And particularly with regard to our bilateral relationship with China, yes, we have been engaging with them. Yes, we have an agreement on peace and tranquility at the border. And yes, there have been several rounds, I think 18 altogether, of conversations between high-level envoys of the two countries to resolve the border dispute. Now, if we can have 18 rounds of unfruitful conversation, why can't we have 18 rounds of unfruitful conversation with the Pakistanis? I think we are our own worst enemy. We are not able in our diplomacy to move from the syndrome of having excellent relations with Paraguay, but completely bewildered when it comes to Pakistan. And I think this plays its way out all around our neighborhood because we are looked upon as the big South Asian bully. We are not looked upon as the benevolent South Asian giant. And until our mindset changes, there's bound to be a desire on the part of our neighbors to bring China in. And I think that is why China is able to come in, not because the Chinese are able to overtake the Indians. The Chinese are regarded as a benevolent, yes, all right, use the word hegemon, but they are looked upon benevolently. And I think what we achieved in 1988 was to say, all right, let us have a normal relationship, even if we cannot go back to the heyday of Hindi Cheete Bhai Bhai. And the hope was that we could achieve it. And during Manmohan Singh's prime ministership and effective foreign ministership, we had not only a great improvement in the India-US relationship, but simultaneously in the India-Nepal, the India-Pakistan, and above all, the India-China relationship. So I think what we need to ask ourselves is, does India's security rest on infringing the sovereignty of our neighbors or in respecting and enhancing that sovereignty? I think we should be a much more friendly power. We should be seen as benevolent. We should be seen as generous. And if we are seen in this way, then we very quickly arrive at agreements. After all, the 4-point program on Kashmir was negotiated over a period of about 3 or 4 years when there were difficulties, but because there was persistence, we were able to arrive somewhere. And the same applied to China. And maybe I could say the same applied to the United States, because on the one hand, we had a United States that wanted to be a benevolent hegemon and therefore not prone to doing the kind of things that Nixon and Kissinger did with us in 1971. And for the rest, were also willing to forget and forgive. That's how we got away with our nuclear test. That's how Pakistan too got away with its nuclear weapons test. Then we had Kargil, and the Americans played a totally constructive role there. And then we had this nuclear civil agreement, although it's given us not even 1 megawatt, not yet 1 unit of nuclear power, yet it was possible to do that. And yes, we did succeed in getting that agreement through in the international community with the cooperation of China. Therefore, there seems to me to be some mishandling in diplomacy of our relationship with China, that they are standing in the way of our becoming a member of the nuclear suppliers group. But basically, as somebody who belongs to the Gandhian school of thought, I'm wondering why we want to be members of the nuclear suppliers group. Because anything we may need in terms of civil nuclear supplies, we are already guaranteed.
Mr. Aiyar, our time is running, so I want to make sure that I get all the questions in. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. I wanted to ask one more question before I throw it open to the students. And my final question, and if possible, short sort of answers so that I can finish sort of, but in about 10 minutes, I need to take questions from the audience. So my quick question is with respect to, we've spoken about China, we've spoken about sort of the economic relationship, we have spoken about the people-to-people relationship. I was wondering if both of you, starting with Ambassador Singh, could talk a little bit about India and the Indo-Pacific strategy, Quad, and what India is doing and how India views the Indian Ocean region, which is India's neighborhood, and how India views its role in its neighborhood, which it defines from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca. Well, how is the India-US relationship in that neighborhood, and how is the strategic dimension playing out? More importantly, how do you see it playing out in the coming weeks, days, months, with COVID? I mean, reason I'm asking is, for example, during the tsunami, India played a large role. We have a very good and efficient HADR infrastructure. We have helped our neighbors, we have helped the neighborhood. So if you could speak for a few minutes, Ambassador Singh first, please.
All right. So, for a long time, India had very much wanted that great powers stay away from the Indian Ocean region. And there was talk of Indian Ocean also as a zone of peace. For India, before 1947, the dominant external power in this region, the British, was an adversarial power. It had colonized us. Post-47, the dominant external power, United States, at some times friendly, at times adversarial. And therefore, India would very much like that in this region, there is no dominant power that is adversarial towards India. But the change that has now happened with China's economic and military rise is that it has now an increasing footprint in the South Asian and Indian Ocean region, which we discussed. And therefore, that's a challenge that India has to deal with. And just as India looks at hedging its strategies and building its relationship, all the countries around India try to do the same, that they build a relationship with India and they look for hedging strategies. And China has now emerged in the capacity to provide them that hedging. And you see it in Bangladesh, you see it in Sri Lanka, you see it in Nepal. It was happening in Maldives. Now there's a walk back from that. So that's a new challenge that India is facing. And India has to deal with that to safeguard its interests. And at the same time, there's no other ocean in the world that is named after one country. There is that linkage between India and the Indian Ocean. And if you see India's geographic projection into the Indian Ocean region, in the tsunami, India was among the first responders. Even now, it was Indian naval ships that took supplies to Maldives, to Seychelles, went all the way to the Gulf, also brought back Indian expatriates from there who wanted to come back. So there is a certain presence that India has in this region. If you look at India's trade flows, energy and other trade flows to this region, it's very vital. So it is in that framework that India has been building its partnerships. It did a joint strategic vision on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific with the United States in 2015. The Prime Minister made a major statement on the Indian Ocean region at the Shangri-La dialogue, where he projected it as an inclusive concept, that every country had a potential of partnering in this so long as they observed international rules and norms, because there's concern that China has not been observing international rules and norms, particularly in the South China Sea. And it has rejected the ruling of an international tribunal. And it is building military facilities on islands there. India has also been building relations with Japan. In the framework of the Quad, it has been having discussions with US, Japan, and Australia. In the context of COVID, you saw there were some discussions looking at COVID-related responses, which included the Quad plus Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, and another which also brought in Israel and Brazil. So different ways of building relationships are being looked at so that India is able to protect its vital interests in the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Mr. Aiyar?
I am a skeptic on Quad. I cannot reconcile Quad, which is a military alliance, with non-alignment and peaceful coexistence, which I have been taught through at least 60 or 70 years of my life, are the foundation of India's foreign policy. And I believe that what we should be pursuing much more effectively than we have done so far is the look east policy. Yes, we should certainly be looking east. And having served myself in Vietnam during the US invasion of Vietnam, I'm very sympathetically disposed to the people of Asia. I believe in the Asian resurgence, and I therefore cannot conceive of an Asian resurgence without India and China having a harmonious relationship. So I'm glad that we too appear to be inhibited when it comes to giving real teeth to the Quad. The Quad is being projected as a potential formation which will keep the Chinese at bay. But I think instead of resenting and regretting and hoping that the Chinese dragon will go away, we ought to adjust to the reality that the Chinese have been extraordinarily successful economically, but extraordinarily unsuccessful politically. They haven't been able to make themselves into a democracy. They haven't been able to promote human rights, even for their own people. And therefore, there is nothing for us to have an inferiority complex about. But we have to recognize that they are where they are with the consent of the countries concerned. And if there are disagreements between them, as for instance, very starkly between China and the Philippines over their South China policy, there is a way in which the Chinese and Duterte have been getting together and trying to defuse the situation. So I would say that the Quad is provocative, and we don't have the same economic interest in the Straits of Malacca as the Chinese do. Our interest is very much more in the Straits of Hormuz. And so long as the Straits of Hormuz are kept open, and the biggest danger there comes from the American relationship with Iraq and Iran. That's where the danger lies. So I want to see the Asian renaissance of the fight for independence being translated into an Asian resurgence. And so unless we shift our focus to promoting cooperation, peace, and harmony in South Asia to begin with, and eventually all over Asia, then I'm afraid we're going to end up as a minor partner in the Second Cold War. And that is not, I think, a position of dignity in which I would like to see Nehru's India descend in the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Aiyar. I'll now sort of ask each of you questions which have been sent in by our students. Ambassador Singh, I will ask you this question. One of the students wants to know, as you know, you serve the US Convention on International Religious Freedom has listed India as a country of particular concern. And so the question is, will this make a sort of have a negative impact on the overall India-US bilateral relationship, or can the relationship weather such incidents?
So what the US SURF has done is nothing new. This is a It's not really a governmental organization, but it's a commission that has been set up where there are representatives nominated by the US president, by the speaker, by the Senate majority leader, and then they meet and come up with recommendations. There's a separate process that the State Department runs. They come out with their own report on international religious freedom. And then SERF makes its recommendation. It depends on that, what the Congress or the administration wants to do with that. So this has been going on for years and years. And they have certain compulsions because the way the body is set up, they need to show as if they are very, very responsive, sensitive on issues. But very often there have been members of US SERF who have taken dissenting views on the recommendation of SERF, including in this report. So there is, different viewpoints. So I think we should just take it in our stride. Like in all democracies, there are differing opinions, dissenting opinions. US SERF reflects one kind of opinion within the US, which makes a certain assessment of India. But the broader US mainstream assessment is a positive assessment of India, which sees value in the India relationship. And as I mentioned, for the last 20 years, with changes in government, the relationship has continued at a certain trajectory. So we need to be firm in our position, but this is something we just have to live it and live with and move beyond.
Thank you. The second question, which has come in, is sort of do you see any changes, in the India-US relationship after the pandemic? Will there be any sort of specific focus you see in the immediate next 6 months, 1 year, directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic? Ambassador Singh and then Mr. Aiyar.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, we'll have to watch what happens on the supply chains. For a long time, the US was focused on globalization of production, especially as Mr. Aiyar had also mentioned, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a unipolar moment. And at that time, the world led towards globalization of production and trade. Now they have seen the blowback from that. And in fact, the election of President Trump itself was a reflection of that. But COVID has once again brought to fore the dangers of depending or concentrating too much on one country as a hub for the supply chain. So there is going to be rebalancing of the supply chain. And so we have to see that given our own economic difficulty, what is the opportunity that will emerge for India in manufacturing, in digital technology, in pharmaceuticals. Now, for example, for PPE, now India has emerged as the second largest producer in the world. So that is what we'll need to look at. And I think in the reordering of supply chains, clearly there will be new opportunity. And I think US will value even more the relationship with India, and we should work on that.
Mr. Aiyar, would you like to make any comments?
Yes, I do believe that one of the issues which we have to confront almost immediately is the vote that we will cast at the resumed session of the World Health Assembly on observer status for Taiwan. If you looked at the American press in the immediate run-up to the World Health Assembly, there was a wide expectation that there would be a majority, a huge majority, in favor of Taiwan. And it was literally on the day that the conference opened that Taiwan said that no, they're not pressing their request. And the letter addressed to the Director General was signed by a number of Western, Caribbean islands, Pacific islands, Central American dictatorships. There was nobody significant in it because the US did not have the kind of support it wanted, because the admission of Taiwan was connected with trying to issue a stern rebuke to the People's Republic of China. And that didn't happen. And there is no time to go into this, although I was hoping your earlier questions would give me the opportunity. I look upon the World Health Assembly's recent session as a stinging rebuke to Mr. Trump, a quiet victory for the European Union and President Xi, and an undiluted triumph for Director General Ted Ross. But there's not time enough to go into all that. All I can say is that as the chairman of the WHO Executive Committee, over the next 12 months, we cannot continue to hide behind the kind of anodyne statement that our health minister made. Our health minister certainly supported the Chinese position on pooling of resources and equitable access. The Americans were trying to insist that WIPO must prevail even in this emergency. But we have tried to keep ourselves away from controversy. That is to take a neutral position and not a non-aligned position. So I think in a strange way, it is the World Health Assembly or the World Health Organization and its executive committee that will determine whether we come forward as an independent power in world affairs, which had such great influence in Korea and Indochina and so forth in the old days, or whether we will be an also ran.
I need to cut you short because I need to take one more question and we only have 7 minutes left total for this discussion. So the final question, and Ambassador Singh, it's directed to you. The question they want to know a little more about India-US military relationship, defense side, and especially the 4 logistic agreements that we have signed by now. If you could elaborate a little bit on it, and I have, I think, about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
So, of course, for a long time, we hardly had any military relationship with the US. And as I had mentioned earlier, in 1962, it was the United States that was the major arms supplier to India in the context of the conflict with China. And at that time, Prime Minister Nehru had written to President Kennedy seeking support in the context of that conflict. But after that, with the US, the negative approach it took in 1971, we didn't have much of a military relationship. But with the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement happening in 2008 and higher level technology releases being allowed for India, since then we have contracted to buy almost $20 billion worth of military supplies from the US. Some of them have given us very useful platforms for long-haul aircraft, also maritime reconnaissance aircraft, which have been very useful for India in the framework also of the Indian Ocean. We also now have a defense trade and technology partnership where we are looking at technology partnerships in defense area. Indian companies have also become part of the global supply chain of US defense manufacturers. So that has been a new development. Both countries now do more and more military exercises with each other, Army, Navy, Air Force, Special Forces, and now they've started doing tri-service exercises, again, so that there is a habit of working together, and which again deepens the relationship. To enable all this and also to be able to get higher level technologies from US in defense, which are of interest to India, India has signed now several agreements, including the logistics support agreement, the communications compatibility and security agreement, an industrial security annex so that Indian companies can become part of the global supply chain. So all that has enabled a deepening of defense cooperation with the US, which India has been pursuing because it finds it to be its own interest and of course interest of Indian industry.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. I have one question on CPEC, and that will be the final question which I will ask both of you. The question on CPEC is, the person wants to know that, CPEC as sort of from India's point of view, part of our problem with BRI and CPEC is that it goes through sovereign Indian territory in Jammu and Kashmir. So the question is, what does India plan on doing about it, aside from sort of, either taking it up with China or Pakistan or the United Nations? And is there has India discussed with the United States? Is it going to make any difference or have any impact on the India-US relationship? Ambassador Singh and then Mr. Aiyar.
So first on CPEC itself, clearly first it was important for India to come out with its formal position. That it objects to it is because through its sovereign Indian territory. So that has been established. But using CPEC as a peg, India has come out firmly against the BRI and had made out in its statement that BRI is leading to unsustainable debt for countries, and that has been proved by subsequent events. And India's position has had an impact. There was a time where large number of countries in the world were getting onto the BRI bandwagon. But since then, there have been critical comments and assessments from the United States, from Europe, and now it has been found that many countries that became part of BRI have run into very large debts. So India's position did have an impact in the global assessment and response to the BRI. And so we have to see that and see how the situation evolves.
Mr. Aiyar, would you like to?
I don't see what advantage we are possibly going to get in real terms on the ground by simply objecting to the CPEC going through Indian territory. We have agreed with Pakistan that we will settle these matters bilaterally with Pakistan. And if we are going to bring in America or any other country on the CPEC dispute, then we are simply spitting in our own face. Also, what we say is not going to destroy BRI because nothing we said made the BRI. And I think it was silly on our part not to attend and express there in Beijing our objections to the BRI when the launch conference was held. A very large number of countries who attended did not agree to becoming part of BRI. And we could have done the same. But we just sit by on one side. We always play the non-cooperator. And I don't think that enhances either the strength of our voice, nor gives us a positive role in world affairs. So I think we should have a much more constructive foreign policy than we appear to be doing, and be less dependent on one or more countries.
Thank you, Mr. Aiyar.
Unity and self-respect.
Thank you. I'll now thank both of you very much, Ambassador Singh, Mr. Aiyar, for your remarks, for sort of answering all my questions the students, and I'm going to hand it over to Himangini.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I'll call Akshay Sharma to please address the vote of thanks.
Honorable Shankar Aiyar sir, Arun Kumar Singh sir, Aparna Pande ma'am, and all the participants. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, Akshay Sharma, student of law, Manipal University, Jaipur, on behalf of Manipal University, Jaipur, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Honorable Speaker Shankar Aiyar sir, Arun Kumar Singh sir, and Aparna Pande, who blessed us with their precious presence and took out valuable time from their busy schedule. Whenever we will think about this corona pandemic, we will definitely remind this day when all the schools and colleges are off and we gain such valuable knowledge sitting at home. I also want to thank Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Sharma ma'am, Director School of Law, Manipal University, Jaipur, Kamal Pande sir, Dr. Mehna ma'am, Rishabh Shroff sir, Rakesh Thakral sir, Eddie Shroff sir. As no program can become successful with a single man, I would like to extend my special thanks to Aishwarya Bhatia and Puran Raj Purohit and his team for organizing such a wonderful event. Thanks to Logical and all the participants for their active participation in the event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now I would like to hang up the meeting. Stay safe, stay healthy.